I actually saw Hacksaw Ridge in person. I actually went there. Hi, Sai. Welcome to Passionfroot, where we pursue lives of passion and purpose together. My name is Max, and I'm one of the handful of creators who uploads videos on this channel. Today, I'm doing something a little outside of my normal content, and I'm going to do a review of Hacksaw Ridge. Obviously, it's a movie that's been out for quite some time, so it may seem a little strange for me to be doing this now, of all things, but I do have a reason for why I want to talk about this movie. One of the reasons why you might find my opinion about this movie interesting is because of two significant cultural connections I have to the film. One of them is that, much like the main character, Desmond Doss himself, I am Seventh-day Adventist, so I'm part of the same religious group as him. Secondly, I'm also, by heritage on my dad's side of the family, Okinawan. And Okinawa is the location where the main battle in the film takes place. My grandparents were there during the Battle of Okinawa in World War II. Another preliminary point that I'm going to make right off the bat is that while I do love YouTube reactions and I entertained the idea of doing a reaction video here, I ultimately decided against it for a couple reasons. One of them is that this movie has been out for a long time and I have, in fact, already seen it. So doing a reaction, I think, would be just a little bit inauthentic. It would not be the pure reaction that I think a lot of people are looking for when they go to that kind of content. Not only have I already seen the film a good handful of times, but in fact, and you might find this interesting, I actually saw the movie before it was released, which is a story in unto itself. Again, I am Seventh-day Adventist, and the people in charge of the film's marketing, I think, understood that many Adventists were going to find this movie significant because Desmond Doss's story is a well-known story in Adventist circles. So as the movie was about to roll out, I happened to be visiting my parents kind of out on the East Coast of the United States. While I was there, they happened to be showing like an advanced pre-screening of the movie to church audiences. I sat there with my mom in a like a high school gymnasium where they set up a big screen and some speakers so we could get an advanced look at this story that is really relevant to our faith community. What did I think of the movie? Overall, I liked it a lot. I really enjoyed watching it, hence I've watched it a couple more times. It's interesting to me because going into the movie, Desmond Doss's story was something that I already knew about. It's something that I'd already heard. And again, I think a lot of Adventists inherently are familiar with the story. It gets retold in our circles quite a bit. I knew in broad strokes what to expect, but I think the movie did a really good job on delivering on the humanity of the characters. I think Andrew Garfield did a great job with the character of Desmond Doss. I thought Hugo Weaving was really good as Doss's father. Vince Vaughn was hilarious in this movie. I wasn't expecting the movie to be funny in the way that it was, and for the banter and the relationships between soldiers to be what it was. But I think that there was a lot of good, like, multidimensionality to the way all these characters were portrayed. And I thought that was really great. Yeah, I gotta say, very, very impactful movie and something that I've revisited a bunch of times. All of that being said, I do have some of my own issues with the movie in spite of liking it. So the first thing that really stands out to me is that for whatever reason, and this is not a knock against Andrew Garfield at all, because I think he does a great job depicting Doss as a character, as a person, but that's exactly it. I think he does a really good job conveying the person of Desmond Doss and like his values, his virtues, his struggle. That comes through, I think, very clearly. What I didn't really get from this portrayal of Desmond Doss, and this could be entirely subjective, but I never got the feeling from him like, oh, that's an Adventist. There's a certain vibe that I get from other SDA people. SDA, if you're not aware, that's how we shorten Seventh-day Adventist, because why is the name so long anyways? Like, bro, it's long. Like, SDA, like, just keep it simple, right? But there's something about Adventists where, like, I can meet people and like there are these little cues and hints that I'll get. I'll be like, I know what you are. You're one of us, right? And I think with any cultural or religious group, that's often the case, that like people inside the community can kind of identify each other. With the movie, even though they explicitly allude to him being an Adventist and like he just straight up says it at a couple points, it never feels the way that I feel like when I'm at church interacting with people. And to be fair, again, that is not a knock against the acting or the writing necessarily. There are certain things that, unless you really are part of that community, is just not going to come across. I think that the film was trying ultimately to tell a story about an individual man and his character, and it succeeded at doing that. I just don't think I never got Adventist vibes from this portrayal of Desmond Doss. And if anything, he just kind of generically felt like an American Christian who happened to be a like Seventh Day Sabbath observer, and he had a particular set of convictions about violence and war and was a vegetarian. My other big issue with the movie, and this is what I'm going to spend most of my time on, is that the film has almost nothing to say whatsoever about Okinawa, except for having some American soldiers pronounce it Okinawa, which was really something. Okinawa, if you are not familiar, is like a string of islands. It's a little archipelago of volcanic islands that politically is now part of Japan. It is the southernmost prefecture of Japan, but in like larger scale history, actually existed as its own country, its own nation, the Ryukyu Kingdom, and then things that were antecedent to that. But for a very long period of time, like there was this own nation there in the Ryukyu Islands that had existing trade and like political relationships with Japan, but also with China and a number of other islands in that like Pacific Ocean area, East China Sea, however you want to construe that. So the Ryukyu Kingdom existed on its own as its own place. And in the late 1800s, Japan annexed it. You had this progressive assimilation project where Japan continued to claim more and more like dominance over Okinawa. It really accelerated in World War II because the American invasion of Japan took place through Okinawa. Like that's where the Americans landed. That's why the battle in Hacksaw Ridge happens where it does. So much of the island got destroyed. Most of the infrastructure was just absolutely flattened. Anywhere from a quarter to a third of the native population died during the Battle of Okinawa. The numbers aren't exactly clear, but it's a very significant percentage of the population died. You know, it was interesting, like when I was watching the movie with my mom, she has never been a huge fan of like any depictions of violence in film. So this movie was a lot for her. And I remember afterwards we were having a conversation and she was like, man, that battle was rough for me to watch. I wonder how that was for you, Max, because that was your people that they were fighting against. Starting out, like this movie came out around 2016, right? Starting out around then, I was really beginning to ask more questions about like who exactly counts as my people, because I grew up with a lot of Japanese culture around me. The movies and TV shows that I watched, the video games I played, the food I ate, the church that I went to, the people that I was around, or people that I would meet in school, other students. Like Japanese culture and identity was like very, very strong for me. And that's how I would identify myself to people. Like I'm half Japanese and like half white North American, basically. For me, most of my life, I grew up with this Japanese identity that over the last, I want to say, 8 to 10 years of my life has been gradually shifting towards a more distinctly Okinawan identity as I begin to rediscover and reconnect to more of what is specifically Okinawan. I mean, not only did the Ryukyu Kingdom exist on its own, but it had its own language. The main island of Okinawa speaks Uchinaguchi, which is one of a handful of distinct Japonic languages among several others in that archipelago of islands. They are historically descended from the same common linguistic ancestor as Japanese, but they're not mutually intelligible with Japanese at all. I remember my dad telling me that when my grandparents, his parents, would speak Uchinaguchi to each other, he couldn't understand what they were saying, even though like he could speak to them in Japanese, right? So there's this entire complex web of cultural uniqueness and difference with Okinawa. And for me, when I'm watching the movie, I see the film being willing to acknowledge the agency of the Japanese soldiers. They don't say that much about the Japanese, except for maybe a few uses of one particular slur. But the Japanese are mostly there to be an antagonist and an obstacle to Doss and the American army. And at some points to allow for opportunities for Desmond Doss to demonstrate his kind of indiscriminate compassion and his willingness to even rescue some of the Japanese soldiers. What we don't really ever get is any sense or acknowledgement of the Okinawan people being something other than Japanese. So when, my mom said, like, those were your people that they were fighting up there, and I think about my family's own history, I'm like, on one level, I do still strongly identify with Japanese culture, and I do still feel like a Japanese person, especially in North America. I feel that affinity very strongly, but I'm also specifically something else. And I know that the treatment of Okinawans during and after World War II by Japan was not terribly great. So when I think about like representation of Okinawans in the film, I think in particular of the scene where they're about to, climb up Hacksaw Ridge and get onto the battlefield. But this one sergeant or whatever, I don't know what the military ranks, but he says like, our friends in the Navy are going to soften them up for us. And then you get this scene of the ships just bombarding the land on top of Hacksaw Ridge. And the soldiers are marking like, nobody could survive that. And then the one super like shell-shocked soldier was like, oh no, they can. And you could see this like haunted look in his eyes. The haunted look in my eyes came from the thought of like, I'm pretty sure my grandma was like living in a cave on the island when that kind of shelling was happened, because basically everything had been flattened. There were like not really structures left on the island. And like many other Okinawans, she had to like use like natural rock formations and caves to hide from just this onslaught of destruction. The numbers are pretty staggering. Like anywhere from a quarter to a third of the native population of the island died. Some of that was from the American bombing. Some of it was also from Japanese soldiers forcing the local people to commit suicide if there was some risk of them being overrun or captured by the Americans. To me, it's kind of a story of these two very powerful countries colliding on top of the land of an indigenous people group and not really having any regard for how their international conflict affects these people who were caught in the middle. Within Japan, in the north, there is a group called the Ainu people who have been recognized by the government as an indigenous group. And then there's the Okinawans in the far south who have not yet been recognized as an indigenous people group. In fact, there's this really, really strong push to assimilate Okinawans and treat them as if they are just Japanese and nothing else. Ever since World War II, the United States has had an ongoing military presence in Okinawa. They haven't left since World War II. And the majority of American military bases in Japan, like the significant majority, are in Okinawa, on this tiny island. The US doesn't take up that much land in the rest of Japan as far as military presence, but Japan can justify saying, oh, just put it all in Okinawa by saying like, oh yeah, it's just Japanese people there. Like it's not something different. So it's like, oh yeah, the US military stuff is just mostly in this part of Japan with these Japanese people, but that's actually a different ethnic group entirely. So when I think about like what happened in the movie Hacksaw Ridge, as well as the real history that it's based on, I have a hard time relating to a lot of the goals of the main characters. There's this moment towards the end of the movie where Desmond Doss sustains a pretty serious injury and has to be taken off the battlefield. And as he's being evacuated, one of his comrades comes to him and says like, hey, Doss, we did it. We've taken Hacksaw. The way it's written in the film is meant to be this moment of like relief and reprieve for the audience. It's like, oh, finally, the fighting is over. The violence and destruction is over. Like, we can breathe. And for me, that moment has never felt like relief, because knowing the history, I'm like, that was the beginning of the struggles for the Okinawans. That was the beginning of a decades-long US military occupation that basically still exists. Again, this is not something that the film ever really touches on. The movie can't be about everything, and I recognize that. And the movie is about the character and the integrity of one man, Desmond Doss. And I think that from that individualistic point of view, the movie does a good job of portraying him as a person, his character, his bravery, his integrity. That the movie absolutely nailed. Like, it landed completely. for me, when I zoom out from like a broader human perspective, or when I think collectively, or when I think about like even the gospel and like the broader human family, there's a lot that I can't really resonate with that feels almost contradictory to me. Probably the foremost of those things is the moment when Desmond Doss is on trial, right? He's potentially going to be court-martialed because of his refusal to use a gun, a refusal to complete his marksmanship training. And one of the things that they ask him is, if you are so radically and diametrically opposed to even touching a gun, why do you insist on participating in a combat unit? Again, maybe there's some distance between the film's portrayal of Desmond Doss and the real person. But as far as the way he's portrayed in the film, this version of Desmond Doss kind of reveals something about his perspective that to me, I just can't really connect to. And he says, because when the Japanese attacked us in Pearl Harbor, I took that personally. And to me, this is really interesting because one, Pearl Harbor, that's in Hawaii, right? So what you have here is one extremely powerful empire with a powerful maritime presence stepping on and overtaking the land of an indigenous group in Hawaii and claiming it for their own. The United States did that. And then they get mad at another powerful imperialist maritime Pacific power, Japan, attacking them there, with, again, no reference to whether or not an American from the continental United States should be able to refer to anything on the island of Hawaii as us. Like, there's a big question mark for you. And then using that as a rationale to go attack Japan through the territory of another indigenous group that doesn't necessarily have 100% a stake or a say in what's happening. Desmond Doss's whole thing is his nonviolence, his pacifism, his conscientious objection. He does not want to be a participant in the violence. And yet his very answer in this moment, saying like, well, I took it personally when Japan attacked us, and that's why I must be part of basically being a support class, playing a support class for a combat unit. He also feels a duty and an obligation to be part of the United States' use of violence. He voluntarily becomes part of the military-industrial complex. It reveals, I think, a contradiction in the principles that he held with integrity, if that makes sense. Like he was consistent with what he believed in. Some of what he believed in was a little contradictory. And I think it ultimately came down to the fact that he was a human being, a real person, and specifically a white American man who felt a willingness to participate in America's war machine, but just individually not getting his hands dirty. And I think there's a number of moments in the film where that question comes up quite legitimately. And it kind of raises the question of like, what does count as actually shooting back? Is it legalism? Is it just the technicality of like, well, technically my hands didn't touch the gun, but like I was there to support lots of people touching guns. And for this to be a conflict between two huge world powers trampling over the territory of indigenous people groups, like that actually means something. And there's something inherently very American about Desmond Doss's willingness to participate in that. And I think that's probably a really big blind spot for him. I will say I do continue to admire him as a person because, again, it takes a lot to accomplish what he did. I do think it's worth pointing out some of these deeper hidden contradictions in his story. Now, for me, I saw this movie in 2016 when it came out. And from there, I embarked on a bit of a journey of rediscovery. I was still identifying myself to people as like half Japanese, but I knew that I was missing some pieces because I didn't know much about specifically where my family had come from in Okinawa. Within the next couple years after the film came out, I had the privilege of actually traveling to Okinawa for the first time. Oddly enough, the Japanese church that I grew up attending in Toronto, where I'm from, went on like a mission trip in conjunction with one of the churches there in Naha. Oddly enough, the church was one that my grandfather had had a hand in planting. Context, My grandfather, I don't know if he was exactly the first, but he was one of the first Okinawans to become a Seventh-day Adventist pastor. For even broader context, at the time of World War II, like prior to World War II, there was already an established Seventh-day Adventist presence in Japan. Like there were Japanese Adventists, but there were not Okinawan Adventists yet at that point. The Okinawan Adventist Church did not really begin growing until after World War II, which is when missionaries moved in. I learned a little bit about that story through this book, which is Adventure for God on Okinawa by Iona Clark Jensen. This is a woman who was part of one missionary family who came to the island after the war. My grandpa does feature as a character in this book from the missionaries' perspectives about how they first interacted with him, how they brought him on board as a translator because he was doing pretty well in his English classes in school, and he eventually developed a relationship with them, and through a series of interesting events ended up going to a Seventh-day Adventist school in mainland Japan, where he kind of really became fully converted and then became a pastor. Definitely an interesting read. So great that there's no weird, heavily racializing language used within the first few pages. We had boarded ship and sailed from Yokohama late one evening. There would be no welcoming committee, for not one of Okinawa's nearly 600,000 dark-skinned people had yet heard of Seventh-day Adventists. Not one knew the joy of belonging to God's remnant church. I think there's an inherent complexity for Christians of the global South, for example, in how we relate to Western Christian missionaries, both believing in the gospel and then also having to reckon with the history of colonialism and imperialism. But that's probably a conversation for another time. But I wasn't unaware of that while also going for a mission trip to Okinawa and, doing something that did feel very significant, like being able to speak at the church that my grandfather helped to plant. Like that was obviously very historically significant for me and my relationship to my family. And I actually saw Hacksaw Ridge in person. I actually went there and got to see, the signage that the government had put up to kind of explain the history. I got to see the actual size and scale of things. I don't think that the real thing is necessarily as tall as it looks in the movie. Like the actual Maeda Escarpment isn't quite as like looming and massive as it looks in the film. One of the things that was really striking is that there's also actually like a massive graveyard on Hacksaw Ridge now. Like the sheer number of graves is it's really striking to see in person. Like me and my dad walked through there, and it was like, I don't know, it left a really big impression on me that whether you carry a gun into battle or not, war leaves an unremovable scar on a people, and the memory of those lost is important. In many ways, World War II is the story of the accelerated stripping away of Okinawan agency over what happened to their own island and who they could even claim themselves to be. Ourselves. I'm one of them. Or at least I'm learning what it means to be one of them. I've got my guardian Shisa here. The Shisa, you'll see them all over the place in Okinawa. You'll see them at like the entrances of buildings or on top of buildings or just in public places. Usually they're in pairs. One of them will have their mouth closed. One of them will have its mouth open. And it's kind of ambiguous, at least from the sources I've seen, about which one keeps good luck in and which one keeps bad luck out. But one or the other is in charge of doing each of those tasks respectively. It's a part of Okinawan mythology that is much more closely tied to China than it is to the rest of Japan. It was cool to see that in person and to get a shirt like this. It was interesting, even going there in 2018, a couple years after the movie came out, a couple years after Hacksaw Ridge came out, I was struck by just how many shops still had Hacksaw Ridge merchandise and like t-shirts and stuff on their shelves. It also gave me a sense of how normative the Japanese language has become in Okinawa. And since then, I've been looking into the various parts of Okinawan cuisine, trying to understand like just how many languages there are in the different parts. What's the language of the part that my family is from? And as far as I can trace back, like they were in Naha for a long time. So like Uchinaguchi is probably a fair guess. And, because it's now an endangered language, I've kind of made up my mind that even now, as I'm working on learning Japanese that I never really fully picked up in my childhood, I also want to, at one point in my life, at some point, learn Uchinaguchi and do my part in trying to revitalize and keep this language alive. And probably most significantly for me, in terms of something that I'm actively involved in right now, while me and my dad were kind of like walking around in like the shopping district in Naha, we came across a sanshin shop. The sanshin is a three-stringed, kind of like a banjo almost. The name literally, san is three, shin is strings, three string, right? It's this stringed instrument that derives from a very similar instrument in China. And then the sanshin in Okinawa was the predecessor to the much larger, louder, and wider ranged shamisen in Japan. I'd heard people play a shamisen before. I'd had a chance to try out a shamisen before. It's a complex and demanding and high skill instrument that I always thought was cool. But while I was in Okinawa, I got to try out the sanshin, which is kind of like the native defining instrument of Okinawa. And my dad really surprised me. We left at different times because we were going back to different spots, different places. But he actually bought one and brought it back to North America and gave it to me as a gift when I was not expecting it. So ever since then, I've been on this slow but gradual journey of learning how to play the sanshin. And that has been really fulfilling to me, both as like an extension of me as a guitarist, like being able to find new ways of expressing myself, or like extending how I already express myself on guitar to something that belongs to my heritage and connects me to Okinawa. I literally have a little piece of Okinawa with me all the time. And what's been really cool for me is that in the time since then, I've been slowly working on, developing some proficiency with this instrument and working it into my own music. And not too long ago, my band premiered a new song during one of our shows that begins, well, when we do it live, it begins with a sample of me playing Sanshin. Being able to do that and say like, hey, I'm infusing some of my culture and my heritage into my metal music now. So listen, the Sanshin is now showing up in hip hop, and they're doing all kinds of interesting stuff in pop music with Okinawa, but like I don't think anyone's made it metal yet. Okay? So someone had to do it, and that someone is going to be me, and it is me. It's been cool going from like not really being connected to my Okinawan heritage to finding a way that in a way my church side of my identity gave me the opportunity to connect to my like ethnicity, and that was really cool. And in some ways that almost feels like an act of reconciliation, or at least a step of reconciliation for me personally, not for everybody, but for me and my experience as an Okinawan Adventist, whatever that means. If there's any takeaway from this story for you, this is just a reminder that we're all complex and our histories all have layers. Some of them are ugly, some of them are beautiful. And the people that we end up becoming is a dynamic part of how we reconcile those various pieces of our history, our heritage, our culture, and the people who came before us. Look for the best of your forebears. Look for the inspiring things that they did, learn from their mistakes, and try to find ways to make the disparate pieces fit together. It may feel like a contradiction, or it might be synthesis. Once again, this is Passionfroot. We are about pursuing lives of passion and purpose, and the other creators on this channel are all awesome people who inspire me on the regular. So make sure you subscribe to this channel. Check out our other videos. Again, I cannot emphasize enough, like I work with some really, really cool people who have awesome stories to tell. So Nife Debiru for checking this out. If you have any thoughts, leave them in the comments. And aside from that, I'm out.